So if you watched my last video, you'll recall that I asked you to do one simple thing. I asked you to pull out your actual lab report and look at what was tested. Your doctor said everything was normal, the message that came with it, but I wanted you to look at your actual lab results. So let's answer the next obvious question. What blood tests should you be looking for if you still feel tired all the time? Now, today I'm going to walk you through 5 areas that I commonly look at when someone is dealing with persistent fatigue. But I want to make something really clear before I start. I'm not suggesting that every woman needs every test that I'm going to mention. The goal is not to order more lab tests. The goal is to ask better questions to determine what testing actually makes sense based on your symptoms, based on your history, and what's already been evaluated. So let's go ahead and start. I'm not going to get real clinical in this, so you don't have to be a practitioner to understand what I'm talking about here. You just have to look at it with some different eyes and be open to what you're seeing. So let's start with one that you've probably already had. It's a standard one that's always tested every year. It's called a CBC or a complete blood count with differential. And typically this is the one that's going to tell us whether you have anemia, or it's going to indicate signs of that, especially if you're struggling with fatigue. So it does give us, the CBC gives us information about your red blood cells, about your white blood cells, about your hemoglobin, hematocrit, platelets, and several other markers, but they're all related to your blood. So when we're talking about fatigue, one of the obvious things we're looking for, as I just mentioned, is anemia. So if your hemoglobin and your hematocrit are within range, and you'll see those, they're right up there at the very top of the CBC. If they're within range, that's useful information. But here's where things get interesting. A normal CBC does not necessarily tell us everything about your iron status. And I'm going to come back to that because it's important enough that I've devoted the entire next video to it. But for now, if you're looking at your lab report, I want you to simply ask, was a CBC done and what were the actual results? Okay, that was number one. The second area is your iron status. And this is where I often want more information than just whatever the CBC provides for us. So depending on the individual, that may include something called a ferritin test, along with other iron studies such as serum iron, TIBC, and transferrin saturation. Don't even worry about all those words. Most importantly is just knowing that ferritin alone gives us information about what's happening with the iron that your body's actually storing, while those other markers help us understand different aspects of how the iron is being carried and utilized. And that's an important, very important distinction. You can have a CBC, the normal test, that doesn't show anemia and still have reasons to take a closer look at what's going on with your iron status. That doesn't mean the iron is causing everyone's fatigue. And it certainly doesn't mean that everybody should go out and start taking more iron. That's not actually a good thing to do at all without having some guidance along the way. It means that we need the right information before we draw any conclusions. That was number two. Number three is a very, very popular one, and that's thyroid testing. This is a one where I frequently hear women say, well, my thyroid was checked and everything was normal. And so my next question is, what was actually checked? Very often when we pull out the report, and on this one, it's on page 2, but it could be anywhere on your report. Just look for the thyroid um, uh, information. And the TSH, very often, again, when we look at it, the marker that's been tested is TSH. And it's very valuable information, but depending on your symptoms and your clinical situation, there might be reasons to look at additional thyroid markers, such as free T4, and in some situations, free T3, and even reverse T3, and the thyroid antibodies. So there's so much more than just looking at the TSH. One of my clients came to me recently with significant fatigue and brain fog.
And she told me that her thyroid had already been checked. And when I reviewed her previous testing, it was simply the TSH was the only thyroid marker that was measured. But as I dug into more of her story, and later into this series, I'm going to show you what happened when we looked more closely and what we changed for her over the following 3 months and what made all the difference. But for today, here's what I want you to remember. Don't just ask was my thyroid normal? I want you to ask which thyroid tests were actually performed. That was number 3. Number 4 is our vitamin B12 status. Now, B12 plays an important role in your red blood cell formation and your nervous system function. So, when someone is experiencing persistent fatigue, weakness, difficulty concentrating, or brain fog, B12 status may be one piece of the picture that's really worth evaluating. Sometimes a serum B12 level gives us the information we need, and yet in other situations, an additional marker, and you don't have to remember all this, but an additional marker called the MMA, it's methylmalonic acid, didn't say that right, may provide useful information when your B12 status is kind of uncertain. So again, I'm not suggesting that every tired woman has a B12 deficiency. But what we're doing is we're gathering clues, and we're always asking whether these clues fit what she's actually experiencing. And we come to number 5. Number 5 is what I'll broadly call metabolic testing. This may include a comprehensive metabolic panel, what's called a CMP, a fasting glucose, and hemoglobin A1C, with additional metabolic markers considered depending on the individual. So, a comprehensive metabolic panel, and that's again one that's almost always run on an annual blood panel. It usually starts with the CBC and then it goes right into the CMP. It gives us information about things like your glucose, about your electrolytes, your kidney function, and any liver related markers. And blood sugar regulation can also matter when we're trying to understand your energy patterns. For example, there's a difference between a woman who wakes up exhausted and a woman who feels reasonably good in the morning but crashes every afternoon. So those patterns matter. This is why I don't simply look at a lab report and treat the numbers. I'm asking what's happening in this woman's life, and do the laboratory findings help us understand that pattern? So now you might be thinking, well, what about vitamin D? And what about folate? And what about inflammation? What about hormones? Well, these are all very important. So there are other tests that may be appropriate depending on the person. But that's exactly why I don't believe in handing every woman the same enormous lab panel. More testing doesn't always necessarily mean better testing. So the goal is the right testing for the right woman at the right time. Your symptoms, your health history, your medications, your nutrition, your sleep, your digestive health, your previous lab findings, and other factors all help determine what we want to do to take a closer look. So here's what I'd like you to do. Pull out your most recent lab work, just like you did on the last video. And I want you to look for these 5 areas, and I'll list them again. Those 5 areas are your CBC with differential, your iron studies, including ferritin, if you have them, your thyroid testing, and specifically which thyroid markers were tested, your vitamin B12, if that was tested, and your metabolic testing, such as your CMP, your glucose, fasting glucose, and your A1C. Chances are your standard panels don't have all of those, but you probably do have more than likely the CBC, the CMP, and the TSH for your thyroid. So don't try to diagnose yourself from the numbers. For now, I want you to simply identify what information do I already have and what information might I still need. And before we finish, I want to go back to something I mentioned at the beginning. Iron is a perfect example of why the right test matters. I've talked with women who were told that they weren't anemic because their CBC looked fine
And they naturally assumed that meant that their iron status was fine too. But those aren't exactly the same question. So in the next video, we're going to unpack that. It's called Still Exhausted, but your CBC is normal. The iron test you might be missing. So I'll explain what a CBC can tell us, what ferritin and other iron studies tell us, and why understanding the difference matters when you're trying to figure out persistent fatigue. I'll see you there.